You believe the organization you work for operates on something resembling merit. That performance is tracked, that accountability exists, that the people creating problems will eventually face consequences, and the people solving them will eventually be recognized. You have held that belief patiently, sometimes for years, while the evidence accumulated against it. Then, the restructuring came. The wrong person survived. Again, it was not an accident. It was not a mistake. It was the system producing exactly the outcome it was designed to produce, and the design has nothing to do with performance. My name is Jackson. What I want to show you today is the actual logic behind every inexplicable workplace decision you have ever witnessed. Not the official logic, the operational one. Once you see it clearly, nothing will confuse you again. That clarity is uncomfortable. It is also the only thing that gives you any real control. Picture someone 4 years of documented, consistent, high-quality output, every deliverable on time. Every process improvement is implemented without being asked. A manager who trusts them completely. 3 formal complaints filed on behalf of the team, not themselves, about a colleague whose pattern of underperformance has affected project outcomes across multiple quarters. Every complaint was received. Every complaint was acknowledged. None produced a visible consequence. The restructuring arrived. The organization needed to reduce the team by 1 position. The person with 4 years of documented excellence was included in the reduction. The colleague who generated 3 formal complaints was not. The question this person was left with, the one they could not resolve through any rational framework they had access to, was simply, how? Here is the reframe. The decision was not irrational. It was not arbitrary. It was produced by a system that was working exactly as designed, a system that does not optimize for performance or contribution or fairness. It optimizes for 1 variable only, the management workload implications of each person's continued presence versus their removal. The system ran that calculation. It produced a result. And the result was entirely predictable to anyone who understood the calculation. The problem was never the decision. The problem was not knowing what the decision was actually based on. The workload calculus. Every time a performance complaint reaches a manager, a calculation begins. It is not a fairness assessment. It is not a merit review. It is a direct, unsentimental evaluation of what resolving this situation would require from the person responsible for resolving it. Documentation, process, legal risk, transition management, knowledge transfer, the personal liability of a decision that might be challenged. Every one of those costs lands on the manager making the call. And if the aggregate cost of removal, measured in managerial time, attention, and exposure exceeds the aggregate cost of continued tolerance, the system produces 1 output. The complaint is filed, and the situation continues. The protected colleague is not being shielded because of loyalty or favoritism. They are being shielded because the calculation produced a number that favored keeping them. The number changes when the removal becomes less expensive than the tolerance. Until that threshold is crossed, the system will not move. And most managers have quietly learned that if they wait long enough, someone like you will absorb the problem and the threshold will never need to be reached. The untouchable employee is not protected by performance. They are protected by the cost of their removal being higher than the cost of their presence. The expectation calibration effect. There is a second mechanism that operates more slowly and more invisibly. When you perform consistently at a high level, you do something to the people managing you that feels like a positive contribution, but functions as a structural liability. You raise their baseline expectation. You become the standard. And standards, once established, create obligations to enforce them broadly or explain publicly why they are not being enforced. Both options require effort. Effort is the thing every management layer is perpetually trying to minimize. The chronically underperforming colleague has done something structurally opposite. Through sustained, low-grade dysfunction over months and years, they have trained the people above them to expect less. The bar has descended so gradually that anything marginally above their floor registers as adequate. Their dysfunction has become the predictable state. Predictable states do not require intervention. Intervention is the cost the system avoids by tolerating them. This explains the pattern that feels most irrational from the outside. A manager who responds to your minor mistake with visible frustration while extending what appears to be infinite patience to a colleague who makes that same mistake on a consistent basis. The response is calibrated, not arbitrary. Your error violated an expectation. Their error confirmed one. And violations trigger reactions in a way that confirmations do not. You are being held to the standard you built. They're being held to the far lower standard they negotiated through sustained underperformance, and management accepted the negotiation without realizing they were in one. The compensation trap. Here is the mechanism that operates most quietly and extracts the most from the people it affects. At some point, probably without a single conscious decision, you began compensating. You absorbed tasks the underperformer was not completing. You routed critical work away from their gaps. You built workarounds into your own processes to keep outcomes intact despite the dysfunction. You told yourself it was professionalism, team orientation, keeping things functional. The actual effect was different. Each time you compensated, you removed the operational consequence that was the only realistic trigger for management intervention. You solved the problem that would have eventually forced a decision. The dysfunction remained. The visible impact of the dysfunction disappeared, absorbed into your additional output. Management observed that outcomes were acceptable. They attributed that acceptability to the system rather than to your specific labor. And they had no structural reason to change anything. The arithmetic is stark. You were performing portions of two roles. You were compensated for one. The underperformer was performing a fraction of one role and receiving equivalent compensation. Management had evidence the situation was sustainable. You produced that evidence voluntarily, at direct cost to your own time and capacity. Every time you compensated for the underperformer, you handed management the justification they needed to keep them. You solved their problem for free. Here is where the dynamic becomes structurally self-reinforcing in a way that compounds with time. Because the longer you absorb the dysfunction, the more deeply the system adapts around your absorption of it. Management's workflow accommodations quietly incorporate your compensation as a baseline assumption. The organizational design, informally and without documentation, begins to treat your additional output as the normal operating state. You are no longer going above and beyond. You have defined the floor. And the floor now requires your continuous presence to hold. Simultaneously, the untouchable colleague is not static. They are learning. The longer they survive without consequence, the more precisely they understand the specific behaviors that preserve their position, the minimum output required to avoid triggering removal, the relationships to maintain, the institutional knowledge to hold without documenting. They are optimizing for survival in the system that actually exists. You are optimizing for performance in the system you believed existed. One of those optimization strategies is working. The restructuring does not interrupt this pattern. It accelerates it. When reduction decisions are made under pressure and time constraints, the system defaults to its most accessible calculation, whose absence creates immediate, uncontrollable disruption, and whose absence can be absorbed with manageable redistribution. You made your absence manageable. They made theirs catastrophic. The list was written before the meeting started. You were not let go because you were replaceable. You were let go because you spent years proving that you were. If this is landing for you, take 2 seconds to hit the like button. It genuinely helps the channel, and it tells me to keep making content like this. The reframe is this. Stop measuring your professional security by the quality of your output and start measuring it by the cost of your absence. Those are different numbers. In most organizations, they require different behaviors to build. And the gap between them is where most high performers are operating without knowing it. Building genuine extraction costs is not about hoarding information or manufacturing dependency through dysfunction. That is the brittle, short-term version of this strategy, and it eventually collapses. The durable version is about embedding yourself in the outcomes the organization cannot afford to lose, and making the connection between your presence and those outcomes visible to the people who make structural decisions. 3 specific moves. First, stop compensating this week. Identify one task or responsibility you have been absorbing to cover for the underperformer's gap and redirect it not with confrontation, simply by declining to absorb it. Route it back to where it belongs. Allow the natural operational consequence of the gap to surface in front of the people who have the authority to respond to it. You cannot manufacture urgency for management, but you can stop preventing the urgency that would emerge naturally if you stepped back. Second, this month, map your current work against the 2 or 3 outcomes your organization is most directly measuring right now: revenue, retention, risk, cost efficiency, and assess honestly what percentage of your effort connects directly to those outcomes. Deliberately increase that percentage. Work that connects visibly to organizational priorities is structurally harder to eliminate than work that is important but difficult to trace to anything the organization formally measures. Third, have one direct conversation with your manager this month. Not a hint, not an implication about your trajectory and what the organization needs to see to advance it. This conversation does 2 things simultaneously. It makes your ambition visible, which converts you from a static asset into a potential flight risk, and it creates a documented moment of engagement that makes the decision to eliminate you in a future restructuring more complicated than it would be if you remained silent. There is a version of professional commitment that looks from the inside like doing everything right and looks from the outside like the most efficient possible way to remain exactly where you are. The work is real. The competence is genuine. The reliability is consistent and appreciated. And none of it produces the security it was supposed to produce because the system calculating security was never measuring those inputs. The adjustment required is not a compromise of the things that make you good at your work. It is a shift in what you optimize for alongside that work, not instead of it, alongside it. Building the extraction cost that makes you structurally difficult to remove, making visible the contributions that are currently invisible to the people who matter. Stopping the compensations that have been providing management with a reason not to act. None of that requires becoming someone different. It requires understanding, with precision and without resentment, the system you are actually inside and making deliberate choices about how to operate within it. The system was never broken. It was just optimizing for something you were never told it was measuring. And if this gave you something concrete to work with, consider subscribing. I make content like this every single week. No performance, no noise, just the workplace truths that most people learn far too late and at far too high a cost. I will see you in the next one.